next morning, Professor Mickelson stopped Mark. His voice softly echoed in the corridor.
Now that we're alone, I have something to ask you. It's been a few years since you brought the boy to us. Have you changed your mind? Are you thinking of making Johnny your protege? Will we have a new Tyro in the family soon? Everyone thinks you will. You could change him after we wake up from hibernation. He'd look older than you, but at least he wouldn't be stuck in a teen's body.
I promised Johnny that I wouldn't do any of that, and I'm going to stand by it.
No, I want Johnny to be however he wants to be. I want a normal connection. I want him to grow up and someday grow old. He once told me that it was sad that I could never have grandkids. Maybe he's right. You know, if Johnny has some in the future, I hope that he'd let me think of them as family too. It'd give me hope.
And what if one of his descendants tells someone they're not supposed to?
How about this? I'll be extra choosy who I'll tell. I'll be their Uncle Mark until they're older. If Johnny thinks it's best not to tell his future kids, then I'll respect that too.
Fine, but in exchange, you'll hibernate. After we wake up, if you still think this is a good idea, I won't stop you. It's a beautiful dream, Mark. I hope that he'll have enough adopted grandchildren for you to have roots in the human world.
Mark's bedroom was packed, his clothes neatly tucked into stacked bins, his bookshelves empty. His dresser was stripped. Instead of comforters and sheets, a thin plastic casing sealed his bed. It was strange to stare at bare walls. Mark had confidence that no matter how many years later he woke, his collared shirt, jacket, and slacks wouldn't become a strange outfit overnight. The professor promised Mark that after hibernation they'd read Sir Garnier's diary together. As Mark stood in his empty room, thumbing his society ring, he noticed Johnny passing by his room for the fourth time.
Are you going to get used to me gone?
At his voice, the teenager stopped. He'd grown since he'd first caught the vampire biting a woman in the alleyway. He was now a man.
No, of course not. Are you really going to go through with this? I mean, sleeping 20 years is a long time.
Mark wanted to stay with Johnny until he graduated, but a promise was a promise. This was the society's way. If he stayed around any longer, people would notice how he never changed, and eventually Johnny was beginning to look closer to Mark's age. He was already starting to get strange looks. The two of them could pass as brothers.
Yeah, 20 years may seem like a long time for a human, but it's supposed to feel short to a vampire. The whole idea is weird for me too. I've never done anything like this before.
Will we keep in touch?
Johnny was on the verge of tears. He'd already lost one family. Now he'd be losing another.
Of course you'll see me again, but by that time you may not want to visit a vampire if you have a wife and kids.
You're my family. Of course I'd want you to meet them. You're not just a vampire. You're the only person who's ever cared about me. I want to see you again. It's not fair. I meet you and finally I have a normal life. And now you're leaving. I'll be alone again.
I wouldn't call living with a vampire normal. You know I have no choice. I need to hibernate. People will be suspicious of me if I stay the same age as you.
Couldn't you and I move somewhere, and when the society wakes up, we meet with them again?
If I was an older vampire, I could. But I'm a tyro. Mickelson said I must learn how to hibernate. He said my life someday could depend on it.
And me being around just screws everything up.
You promised me you'd be able to live by yourself. Don't be sad. If you'd rather live somewhere and with someone else, tell me. Don't force yourself. I don't want you feeling like you must be my house sitter or something. I can sell this place.
What? And leave here for a place with rules? No thanks. I'll be throwing parties here all the time.
What? No parties.
I'll be okay. I promise.
He was always acting independent. Mark laughed as he ruffled his hair.
I'll miss you too, kid.
Mrs. Violet widely grinned as she led Mark and Johnny down the narrow entryway into the formal dining room where Mark had first transformed. All of the society was there, even the elusive Brickfords who occasionally came to society events. Lit candlesticks rested on the table along with 5 crystal glasses filled with a deep red liquid. By its scent, Mark knew it was blood. For Johnny, Mrs. Violet considerably had a 6th glass with a small serving of soda. Mark could not remember her being so cheerful. It was like a new life had entered her. Raising a glass, she made a toast.
To new beginnings, to 2040.
To 2040.
They all repeated the phrase, raising their glasses and drinking their last blood for some time. Glancing around the room, Mark looked at Professor Mickelson, Mrs. Violet, and the Brickfords.
Violet, are you certain you won't stay with me this time?
Quite. I enjoy hibernation. It's so refreshing to wake up after 20 years. Everything will be new again.
I'm having cold feet. What if we never wake up? Who will check on us?
I will. I'll be out of town most of the time, but I will stop by. This may be the last time the Society Arts hibernate. Technology is always changing so fast. I'll stay awake to learn whatever I can of the world while you all sleep.
I can also drive by the house to make sure everything's all right.
Hibernation is important so no one recognizes us aging. It's something we must do.
Now that it's time, I can't believe it's happening. I wish I could have seen Johnny graduate.
You knew the risks when you took him as your ward.
I'll be okay. You'll see. When you come back, I'll be rolling in dough as a successful stockbroker. Maybe even have a brat or 2.
As long as they're not bigger brats than you.
He playfully hit Johnny's shoulder. Mark tried to imagine Johnny with kids. He'd do his best to raise them well rather than to end up like his father. Both Belmonte and Charlie then said goodbye. Belmonte chose to stay at his mansion. His loyal donors would protect and maintain the house while he peacefully slept in a vaulted basement room. Charlie planned to check on him occasionally. Instead of staying with Belmonte, Charlie planned to be awake in New Orleans and learn. He'd write down history, read the news, and play with new technology so that he'd teach the others when they woke. From the outside, many vampires assumed Charlie was simply an ex-prince playboy. He was a considerate person. No matter how beautiful New Orleans was, Mark knew how big his sacrifice was. During the next 20 years, he'd have to find new donors, and if they couldn't be found, he'd be stuck stuffing fish blood from the wharf. New Orleans was a dangerous place for a Colorado vampire. There were different factions there. Mark hoped Charlie made the right choice, but Charlie seemed unconcerned. The society laughed and reminisced. It was getting late in the evening. Mark placed his glass of blood on the dining room table and hugged his ward.
Johnny, it's time for you to drive back.
His heartbeat was naturally faster than the others, but it skipped a beat before it picked up pace.
Not until I know where you'll be sleeping.
He crossed his arms. Everyone gave nervous glances to each other.
Don't worry. Johnny is family. I think that it's right that he'll know where we'll be.
Against my better judgment, I'll show the boy where we'll sleep. I'll also give you a task. On January 2040, you are to call Belmonte's residence and make sure that he's awake first. We'll need many donors when we end hibernation. A lot of blood should be prepared beforehand. We'll be very thirsty.
Johnny gulped.
You won't be needing my blood, will you?
Only if his donors say you must. Hopefully they'll stockpile enough by then. We don't need a whole lot, but blood expires after a month and a half. You never know.
Johnny shivered. Mark held back a groan at Mrs. Violet's tactful inconsiderateness.
No need to dawdle. Let's show the boy where we'll sleep.
The house's owner motioned and led them down into her basement. An old-fashioned oil heater sat in the corner, and the couch that was once in the middle of the room was pushed back against the wall. Pulling a cord to turn on the lights, Violet revealed 5 long pine boxes. Johnny gasped.
You aren't going to sleep in these, are you? They're coffins!
The professor opened one of the boxes and showed that it was comfortably lined with silk and padding. It had discreet air holes on the sides.
Don't be concerned. It's comfortable, inconspicuous, and non-obvious to thieves. The lid keeps the dust away and it opens from the inside. This one is mine. Are you ready to climb into yours, Mark?
Is there anywhere else I can hibernate?
Johnny had said Mark's thoughts perfectly. They were coffins. He started to panic. Although he'd mentally prepared himself to hibernate, he wasn't prepared to sleep in a basement hidden box for 20 years. What if he was trapped forever, never able to escape? He started to breathe quickly. Mickelson frowned at his panicked reaction.
Please, is there anywhere else I can sleep? I don't like being in this kind of room.
His eyes glanced at the door. He was ready to bolt from the place, even if he had to break his promise with Mickelson.
Are you backing out? You told your progenitor you'd hibernate like the rest of us.
It's all right, Violet. Since it is his first time hibernating, let's put him somewhere where he can be more comfortable. I'm going ahead and staying down here. I'll see you in 20 years, Tyro.
Quickly hugging Mark, he tousled his hair before climbing into his box.
Let me show you another place. But it will be a little cramped. We'll have to cover you with a sheet to keep the dust off.
Mrs. Violet led them to the entryway of her little yellow house. She stopped at the couch which sat on one side of the entryway. Lifting the seat cushions, which were attached to a single piece of wood, the elderly-looking vampire revealed a large chest filled with a few scattered books. Mark helped her move the books to the sitting room's table. The inside of the chest was dusty, but it was long enough for Mark to lie inside. He liked the idea of being near the front door. It was much better than sleeping decades in a basement.
There's no padding here. Don't think too much on it. Once we fall into hibernation, we sleep like the dead. Do you think you could stay here? Otherwise, I do not have anywhere else to put you. You certainly cannot stay in my bedroom.
Mark gave a nervous smile.
I can do this. I'll stay here.
I feel better about this, too. I mean, it's a little weird you'll be sleeping inside of a couch, but if a hunter was looking for you, he'd never think of looking here.
Hunters? Why do you think of them?
Mark told me about them once. Do you promise me he'll be safe here?
As safe as any of us are in this world. Our donors will care for and upkeep this place. We're paying them well to do so, and I've arranged for the Culture of Love to occasionally check on the exterior to see it's done.
Those hippies? Are you sure?
Anaya is very reliable. I'm not so sure about the rest of her chapter, but I know she'll see it done.
Mark couldn't help imagining how someone who wasn't a donor would react if they came inside and saw a room full of coffins. A thirsty vampire wouldn't be a welcome surprise to any uninvited guest. Home caretakers were as much for the vampire's safety as the public's.
I feel better now. I'll go ahead. See you in 20 years.
Mark squeezed him in a tight hug.
You're a strong kid. The strongest person I know, human or vampire. You'll do fine. I'm sure of it.
It was the truth. What other teen can survive on the street? Who else can handle staying in the society's company, knowing their secret? Mark said goodbye to the teenage Johnny that night. Who knows what he would be in 20 years? He was looking forward to seeing how he'd grow, even though he would miss the growing part. Johnny didn't stay to see Mark enclose himself. He drove away in Mark's old truck. Mark saw him wipe his eyes as he started its engine.
Are you ready, Mickelson's Tyro?
Yes, Mrs. Violet. We'll wake up in 20 years.
After lightly closing the cushioned lid, Mrs. Violet walked away. The dusty box that smelt of musty books. Mark ignored the smell. This place felt better than where the society was sleeping below ground. Lying in the dark place, Mark listened to every rustle. He listened to every footstep down the stairs, each lid of the pine boxes closing. Mrs. Violet's soft footsteps downstairs, creaking as she tucked herself in. And finally, nothing but the soft ticks of her grandfather clock. In the distance, Mark heard a bird chirping and a few cars driving far away. This was one of those moments that having a vampire's hearing wasn't such a great thing. It was difficult laying quietly. The secret couch cavity was cramped. Mark tried to ignore how his back felt uncomfortable lying against the hard wood. He squirmed. Part of him was grateful to join the Society of Arts in Hibernation, despite everything he would miss. He'd wake to a new world. Besides, learning to sleep 20 years was itself a skill. He would sleep, not just for one night, but for 2 decades. When Mark was a college-age human, he was thankful for even a single night's sleep. Now he would be making up for all of that missed sleep, and then some. After a while, Mark was ready to hibernate as the professor taught him. Closing his eyes, he focused only on his heartbeat, not on the sounds of cars, birds, or the breeze rustling in the leaves outside. Nothing. Mark focused only on himself. He listened to his heart, slower, slower. His breathing became shallow, and he began to dream. He dreamed of Jody. It surprised him. His college crush entered his mind. He imagined her smile, wondered if she had a family, if she became a graphic designer. She was a reminder of what he'd left when he became a vampire. Finally, his dreams meandered into the futuristic world he'd see. Would there be flying cars? He dreamt that they'd be there, zipping around skyscrapers. His thoughts faded until he was wrapped in the nothingness of unconsciousness. Mark's sense of time disappeared, his silence being hid inside of a piece of furniture. His first memory after hibernation was that he felt strangely hot, uncomfortably hot, but he was stiff and couldn't move. Drowsiness pinned down his limbs. Next, he smelt the strong, strange, caustic odor of burning wood and paint. There was the sound of wood, splitting, cracking, shifting. The front door was thrown open and heavy boots thudded nearby. Mark tried to rouse himself awake. Who was outside? It began to get painfully hot. He shouldn't open the couch. If he lied still, the intruder would pass. The cushion lid was thrown open and black smoke poured inside. 2 warm hands grasped Mark's shoulders. Who was it? His blurry eyes tried to make sense of what he saw. The smoke was too dense. A young man lifted Mark up. He was ripped like a fighter, and was definitely not a vampire. He scowled at Mark. The man was completely soaked from head to foot. What was he? A fireman? A vampire hunter? Mark was too drowsy.
Mark, wake up!
How did he know Mark's name? He was so thirsty. It took everything Mark had not to bite him before he realized the answer. Shit! Mark didn't get the chance to recognize him. He was the abandoned kid Mark raised. But Johnny was no longer a kid. Actually, he didn't look too different from when he last saw him. But Mark didn't have time to consider that as Johnny held up a filthy rag to his mouth and coughed in it. That's when Mark realized what was happening around them. Mrs. Violet's house was burning down. A sudden jolt of awareness came. Mark cried out, lunging towards the flames.
Professor? Where is he? I can't feel him.
Don't go in there, it's too late for them.
I must save Mickelson and the others. They're my family too.
Mark kicked and struggled. Johnny locked his bicep around Mark and dragged him out the front door. Mark tried to break free, but the man threw his other arm around Mark's shoulders and continued dragging him backwards. Sparks sprayed from the walls and the couch ignited into flames. The heat was unbearable. The blackness too thick. It engulfed Mrs. Violet's little home. They stood near the street. Angrily struggling, Mark watched a fireball rip up from beneath the house. It was so bright that Mark could see it as the door frame collapsed. No vampire could survive that. Screaming as though his insides were being torn out, Mark stopped fighting and let Johnny drag him away. It was hopeless. None of his friends would have been able to survive something like that. It was too late for them. No tears surfaced, even though he cried. He was parched, and his throat felt raw. Looking at his rescuer, he crawled backwards. A human couldn't understand. Vampires were tougher, stronger. He could kill his friend. His control was slipping fast. With the sound of Johnny's heart quickly pounding with adrenaline, Mark's fangs descended. Soon, the sound of crashing wood faded. All Mark focused on was the sound of his heart.
We'll go back to our house when I know it's safe. Are you okay? You look kind of strange. You're breathing hard.
Get away!
I'm not leaving you here. I called Belmonte's place. His donors woke him up. He'll be here for you soon. Just hang on.
Mark wasn't as calm as Johnny appeared. Dizziness swept through Mark. He was having that feeling of nauseous vertigo like the day he first transformed into a vampire. Mark shook. Thirst gnawed at him, and his eyes locked onto Johnny's throat.
You must go! It's not safe for you now!
Covered in soot, he looked at Mark with a blank stare, but he didn't move. Didn't he have any survivor instincts?
Stop being stubborn! I told you to go! I am thirsty!
Then bite me.
I promised you! I can't hold back this bloodlust! It's dangerous! If I lose myself, if I start drinking, I could kill you!
I trust you. I'll forgive you this once. I won't count this against our promise. You're suffering, aren't you?
He was either very brave or very crazy. Probably both. He scooted closer. He's an adult now. And if I refuse, it could have consequences. I don't think I have a choice here. Temptation crawled over Mark's skin. He shook. He felt conflicted. Johnny was the one person whom Mark trusted with his secret. Mark also kept his promise and never drank from him. It was priceless to have a human who shared a normal relationship. A human who he'd considered family. Johnny was family. The professor was his family. This new family was closer than the one he was born with. Mark's shaking grew worse as he tried to fight his instincts. Healing blood was there in front of him. It was offered freely. His pulse was so tempting. The cotton-like feeling in his mouth wouldn't go away. Instincts won. Mark's hand shot forward and grabbed Johnny's forearm. Teeth broke skin. Gulp after warm mouthful of blood filled his mouth. It was like a dam opened. After so many years of holding himself back, Mark able to drink the untouchable. Too many times the donor was a few days late or sick. Too many times he'd returned thirsty after a long trade trip. Too many times he'd leave on enforcer business where the smell of blood would trigger the edge of bloodlust, but there was no relief. Those times horrified Mark. The huge temptation to bite Johnny made rare moments where he wanted to drink his young blood. It was a secret he could never admit to himself. Those moments horrified Mark. He distanced himself from the kid, hoping that the other wouldn't learn his thoughts. Now, Mark was drinking from him freely. The warm fluid slipped over his tongue. He savoured it. Mark was lost in the taste. He hated to admit it, but he enjoyed this fresh blood. A soft whimper awoke him from his thoughts. Johnny's heart was beginning to slow. Reality shunned him into focus. Mark released his bite. Johnny was lost in the usual euphoria that happens to humans when vampires drink their blood, but he was pale and slightly trembled from blood loss. It was then Mark knew. As long as he was a vampire, Johnny would never be safe. The society had warned him repeatedly about that. He betrayed his trust. He almost killed him. Regret broiled. He was afraid. He lost the professor. Would he lose his other family too?
Johnny, are you okay? Did I hurt you? Maybe I took too much. It's been too long since I last drank blood.
He cracked open an eye. With slow breaths, he spoke.
No, I'm fine. I'm just glad that you're okay. I thought I was going to lose you back there.
Mark looked down at his charred hands. The burns from the fire were quickly healing. Turning his head, Johnny watched in stunned silence as new flesh mended Mark and the ruined parts peeled away.
How old are you? You don't look too different from the last time we saw each other.
21. You've only been asleep for a few years.
A few years. Standing, Mark looked at the orange glowing fire. Acidic smoke filled his nose. The heat was too close. His face wrinkled as he thought about those they'd left behind. He wiped his eyes.
Dumb things on stream, so many dumb